Title: The Craigslist Roommate. It started with a simple Craigslist ad. Roommate wanted. Large room with private bathroom in a 2-bedroom apartment. Great location, $500 a month. No pets, no parties. The price was too good to pass up, especially in a city where rent could easily bankrupt a person. Emily had just moved to the city for a new job and was desperate for a place. She replied to the ad and got a quick response. The landlord, a man named Mark, seemed nice over the phone. He sounded older, maybe in his 50s, and he didn't ask many questions. "The room's available," he said. "Come by tonight and you can take a look." When Emily arrived at the address, it was a nondescript building on a quiet street. It seemed a little too quiet, with no cars or people around. She hesitated, staring at the darkened windows and wondering if she should just turn around and leave. But $500 a month was impossible to ignore. Mark greeted her at the door. He was exactly as she had pictured, tall, wiry, with thinning gray hair and a friendly, if somewhat strained, smile. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. The apartment was modest, furnished with a strange mix of old and new items. An antique clock ticked loudly in the living room, filling the otherwise silent space. The walls were covered with old photographs in mismatched frames. The air smelled slightly musty, like a place that had been closed off for too long. "The room's back here," Mark said, leading her down a narrow hallway. "It's got a good view." The room was large, just as promised, with a window overlooking the street. It had a bed, a dresser, and a closet. It was plain but clean. The private bathroom was a definite plus. Emily felt a sense of relief. "I'll take it," she said, her decision made on the spot. Mark's smile widened. "Great, you can move in right away if you want." Emily moved in the next day. The first night was uneventful. Mark kept to himself, spending most of his time in his room. She barely saw him. He was quiet, almost ghost-like, moving around the apartment without making a sound. On the second night, Emily heard something strange. It was around midnight, and she was lying in bed when she heard a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. She sat up, listening intently. The noise seemed to be coming from the hallway just outside her door. She opened her door a crack and peeked out. The hallway was dark, but she could just make out the shape of Mark standing near the front door. He was bent over, his back to her, and appeared to be dragging something heavy. She felt a chill run down her spine. "Mark?" she called out softly. He straightened up abruptly and turned to face her. His face was partially in shadow, but she could see his eyes, wide and unblinking. "Just moving some things," he said, his voice calm, too calm. "Go back to bed." Emily closed her door, her heart pounding. She lay back down but couldn't sleep. What was he dragging in the middle of the night? And why did he look so startled? The next morning, Mark acted as if nothing had happened. He greeted her with the same strained smile and made small talk over coffee. She decided not to mention the previous night. That night, the noise started again. The same scraping, but this time it was louder. Emily couldn't ignore it. She opened her door again, and this time she saw Mark standing in the hallway, facing the wall. His hands were pressed flat against it, and he was muttering something under his breath. She couldn't make out the words, but his tone was low and frantic. "Mark?" she said, louder this time. He whipped around, and for a moment his face looked twisted in anger. But then he smiled that strained smile again. "Just a little restless," he explained. "I have trouble sleeping sometimes." Emily felt a growing unease. She decided to spend the next day out of the apartment. She went to a cafe and tried to distract herself with work, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Mark and the noises in the night. She wondered if she had made a mistake moving in. Maybe it was time to find another place. That evening, as she returned to the apartment, she saw something strange. One of the photographs on the wall had changed. It was a black and white photo of a woman standing in a garden, but now the woman's face seemed blurred, almost as if it had been smudged. Emily could have sworn the photo had been clear before. She moved closer, examining the photograph. As she did, she noticed something else, a small red stain on the corner of the frame. Her heart started to race. She turned and saw Mark watching her from the kitchen doorway, his face unreadable. "Did you touch this?" she asked, pointing to the photograph. He shook his head slowly. "I told you," he said softly. "I have trouble sleeping." That night, Emily locked her door and propped a chair against it. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She lay in bed, listening, waiting. Around 2 a.m., the noises started again. This time they were louder, more frantic. She heard a faint tapping sound, followed by a soft scraping. Her heart was in her throat. Then there was a knock on her door. Soft at first, then louder. "Emily?" Mark's voice came from the other side. "Are you awake?" She didn't answer. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to remain as quiet as possible. "Emily?" He called again, his voice more insistent. "I know you're awake. I need to show you something." Her hands were trembling. She reached for her phone to call 911, but stopped when she heard a faint whisper, not from Mark, but from inside her room. She froze, turning slowly toward the sound. It was coming from the closet. A soft, faint whisper like a woman's voice. She stepped closer, heart pounding. She could barely make out the words, but it was as if someone was pleading, "Help me." Emily yanked open the closet door and gasped. There, in the back of the closet, was a small hidden door, slightly ajar. Behind it, a narrow staircase led down into darkness. The whispering grew louder, more desperate. The knocking on her door became frantic. "Emily, don't!" Mark's voice was no longer calm. It was panicked, desperate. Emily grabbed her phone and flashlight and bolted out of the apartment, not stopping until she was several blocks away. She called the police, and they arrived within minutes. When they entered the apartment, they found Mark in the hallway, mumbling incoherently. He kept saying she was supposed to be quiet. She promised to be quiet. The police searched the apartment and found the hidden door. Downstairs, in a dark, musty cellar, they found an old chair with restraints and several photos scattered across the floor, all of different women. Each one had their face scratched out. The last photo they found was of Emily, taken in her sleep, her face untouched. The next day, the police told Emily that Mark had once lived there with his wife, who had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. No body was ever found. But Emily knew the truth. Somewhere in the dark, his wife still waited, whispering for help. Title: The Free Couch. Caitlin wasn't usually one to browse Craigslist, but moving into a new apartment had wiped out most of her savings. She needed furniture, and she needed it cheap. As she scrolled through the endless listings, one caught her eye. Free couch. Good condition. Need it gone ASAP. The picture showed a vintage leather couch, dark brown with brass nailhead trim. It looked old, but well-maintained. Her friends would say it was haunted by the look of it, but she didn't care. It was free. She quickly emailed the poster, a woman named Sylvia, who responded almost instantly. "Yes, it's still available. Come pick it up tonight if you can." Caitlin wasted no time. Within an hour, she was driving across town to the address Sylvia had provided. The neighborhood was rough, far from the trendy parts of the city. The houses were old and weather-beaten, their windows dark and empty. She pulled up to a dilapidated Victorian house with a faded "for sale" sign out front. It looked abandoned. She double-checked the address, feeling a twinge of doubt, but Sylvia had said she'd be here. Caitlin stepped out of the car and approached the porch. The door creaked open before she could knock. A small, frail woman with wild gray hair and wide, nervous eyes peered out. "You must be here for the couch," Sylvia said, her voice high-pitched and shaky. "Yeah," Caitlin replied, forcing a smile. "Thanks for giving it away. I really appreciate it." Sylvia nodded quickly, looking over her shoulder. "It's in the living room. Just come in and grab it. I need it gone, tonight." Caitlin hesitated. The woman's behavior was odd, but she needed the couch. "Sure, no problem," she said, stepping inside. The house smelled musty, like mold and old wood. The living room was bare except for the couch. It looked even better in person. She could tell it was heavy, a solid piece of furniture, but she was determined to make it work. "Do you need help moving it?" she asked. Sylvia shook her head vigorously. "No, just take it. I have to go. Just take it." Without another word, Sylvia turned and hurried out the door, leaving Caitlin standing alone in the dimly lit room. Caitlin shrugged, thinking maybe the woman was just a little eccentric. She approached the couch, running her hand over the leather. It felt soft, almost too soft. She decided to inspect it more closely. As she leaned over, she noticed something odd, a dark stain on one of the armrests, nearly black, but with a faint reddish tint. She touched it, and it felt slightly sticky. "Great," she muttered. "Just great." She looked around for a cloth to clean it up, but the room was empty. A shiver ran down her spine. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound a faint creaking like the settling of old wood. Caitlin shook off the unease and got to work, pushing and pulling the couch toward the door. It was heavier than she'd expected, but she managed to get it out onto the porch. She paused to catch her breath, feeling a strange sense of being watched. She glanced up at the dark windows of the house. Nothing. She finally loaded the couch into the back of her pickup, securing it with rope. As she climbed into the driver's seat, she glanced back at the house. Sylvia was nowhere to be seen, but a shadow seemed to move behind one of the upstairs windows. Caitlin brushed it off as a trick of the light and drove away. Back at her apartment, Caitlin wrestled the couch inside with a combination of brute strength and frustration. She collapsed onto it, exhausted. The couch was surprisingly comfortable, almost like it was molding itself to her shape. She laughed, feeling silly for getting spooked. But that night, strange things started happening. She woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of soft creaking. She lay still, listening. The sound seemed to be coming from the living room. Slowly, she got up and crept toward the door. The creaking stopped the moment she stepped into the hallway. She flipped on the light, heart pounding, and saw nothing out of place. The couch sat in the middle of the room, just as she'd left it. She shook her head and went back to bed, convincing herself it was just her imagination. The next night, it happened again. This time she heard whispering, faint and unintelligible. She sat up in bed, straining to hear. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, but she still couldn't make out the words. She got out of bed, her skin prickling with fear, and stepped into the living room. The whispering stopped. The room was dark, the only light coming from a street lamp outside. She stared at the couch, feeling a cold dread seep into her bones. Something was wrong. The couch seemed to shift slightly, as if settling into place. She turned on the light and the room returned to normal. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting. She decided to sleep with the light on. Over the next few days, the incidents grew more frequent and more disturbing. She would find the couch in a different position each morning, a few inches closer to the center of the room. She heard faint sobbing at night, and once she swore she saw a dark shape sitting on the couch just for a moment before it vanished. She finally called Sylvia, desperate for answers. The phone rang and rang, but no one answered. Caitlin decided to drive back to the house. When she arrived, she saw that the for sale sign was gone and the windows were boarded up. She knocked on the door, but no one answered. She peered through a crack in the boards and saw the inside was empty, stripped bare. It looked like no one had lived there for years. Confused, she asked a neighbor about Sylvia. The woman looked puzzled. "Sylvia?" she repeated. "You mean Sylvia Manning?" I don't know her last name. Older lady, gray hair?" The woman nodded slowly. "Sylvia Manning lived there, but she died almost 10 years ago." Caitlin felt a chill run down her spine. "What? But I just met her 2 days ago." The neighbor shook her head. "That's impossible. Sylvia's dead. Died in that house, killed by her husband. They never found his body." Caitlin's mouth went dry. I took a couch from her." The neighbor's eyes widened. "That couch, it was where they found her. She was tied to it, and they said they could still hear her crying for days after." Caitlin turned and ran to her car, her heart pounding. She drove home, not daring to look at the couch. When she got there, she saw it was no longer in the middle of the room. It had moved closer to the front door, as if waiting for her. She decided to get rid of it. She dragged it outside and put a sign on it, "Free couch." She left it by the curb and went back inside. But that night, as she tried to sleep, she heard the familiar creaking, the faint sobbing. She got up, trembling, and opened her front door. The couch was back in her living room, and this time, it wasn't empty. Title: The Forgotten Room. Jenna had always been a little too trusting. When she saw the Craigslist ad for a charming apartment, 1 bedroom plus bonus room, she didn't hesitate to contact the owner. The price was well below market value, which seemed suspicious, but she brushed it off. Maybe the landlord was just desperate to fill it quickly. The landlord, a woman named Diane, responded right away. They set up a meeting for that evening, and Jenna drove to the address with a sense of excitement. The building was an old Victorian on the edge of the city with peeling paint and a neglected front garden, but she had always loved old houses. They had character. History. They felt alive. Diane was waiting for her on the porch. She was a thin woman, probably in her late 50s, with sharp features and an intense gaze. She greeted Jenna with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're right on time," she said. "Shall we go inside?" Jenna nodded and followed her in. The interior would smelled faintly of dust and something else, something metallic. Diane led her through a narrow hallway into the main living area. The place was surprisingly spacious, with high ceilings and large windows that let in what little light remained of the day. It was sparsely furnished, but Jenna could already see the potential. "This is the living room," Diane said. "The kitchen is through there, and the bedroom is down the hall." Jenna nodded, looking around. It seemed nice enough, though it felt colder inside than she would have expected. "And the bonus room?" Jenna asked. Diane paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Oh, right," she said with a strange smile. "The bonus room is down in the basement. It's more like extra storage, but it's technically part of the apartment. I can show you if you'd like." Jenna hesitated. Something in Diane's tone made her uneasy, but she forced a smile. "Sure, I'd like to see it." Diane led her to a door at the far end of the hallway. She opened it, revealing a set of steep wooden stairs leading down into darkness. Diane flipped a switch, and a single dim bulb flickered on, casting long shadows on the walls. Jenna felt a sudden chill, but told herself it was just the basement's cold air. She descended the stairs slowly, with Diane close behind. The basement was bigger than she expected. The walls were lined with old shelves filled with boxes and forgotten objects. In the center was a large wooden door, partially hidden by a curtain. "That's the bonus room," Diane said, pointing to the door. Jenna approached it, her footsteps echoing in the dimly lit space. She reached for the door handle, but Diane quickly grabbed her arm. "I wouldn't open it," Diane said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Jenna frowned, pulling her arm away. "Why not?" Diane smiled, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. "It's old, the hinges are rusted, and it might be dangerous. You don't want to risk it." Jenna felt a surge of curiosity. "But if it's part of the apartment, I'd like to see it." Diane sighed. "Of course, you have every right. But I must warn you, some doors are better left closed." Jenna laughed nervously, trying to brush off the tension. "I think I'll take my chances." She grabbed the handle and pushed. The door creaked loudly as it opened, revealing a pitch-black room. She flicked the light switch inside, but nothing happened. The bulb must have burned out long ago. She hesitated, feeling a strange sensation, like the air was thicker here, heavier. She pulled out her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a small, empty room. The walls were bare, but the air smelled of mildew and something rotten. Diane stood at the doorway, watching her carefully. "Satisfied?" she asked. Jenna nodded, but something gnawed at her. "Yeah, I guess." They went back upstairs, and Diane quickly changed the subject, talking about the lease terms and the neighborhood. Jenna decided to take the apartment. It was too good a deal to pass up, despite the weirdness of that room. She moved in a week later. The first few days were uneventful. The apartment was quiet, and Jenna began to feel comfortable in her new home. She started to forget about the strange encounter in the basement, but on the fourth night, things began to change. It started with a sound, faint but distinct, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on a door. She paused, listening. It seemed to be coming from below. "The basement," she whispered to herself. She brushed it off as the old pipes or the house settling, but the tapping continued. Every night around the same time, just after midnight. It grew louder, more insistent. And then on the sixth night, she heard something new. A faint whisper, barely audible, like a distant voice. It was coming from the bonus room. Curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed her flashlight and crept down the stairs. The air grew colder with every step. When she reached the bottom, she stood in front of the door, listening. The whispering continued, but she still couldn't make out the words. Taking a deep breath, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The flashlight beam illuminated the empty room, but now there was something new, a faint dark stain in the center of the floor. She felt a wave of nausea as she stepped closer, the smell of rot stronger now. The whispering grew louder, and Jenna's heart began to race. It sounded like a woman, her voice low and urgent. "Help. Me. Help." Jenna's breath caught in her throat. She swept the flashlight around the room, but it was empty. The voice grew louder, more desperate. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Jenna jumped, spinning around. The handle wouldn't budge. Panic set in, and she banged on the door. "Let me out!" The whispering stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then she heard it, a low, menacing laugh coming from behind her. She turned slowly, and her flashlight flickered. The stain on the floor seemed to spread, growing darker, like a shadow pooling out from the center. Jenna felt the temperature drop. Her breath fogged in the air, and then she saw it, a faint outline, a shape slowly emerging from the darkness. A figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. It was moving toward her. "No, no," Jenna whispered, backing up against the door. The figure drew closer, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like she was being swallowed by the darkness. She closed her eyes, heart pounding, and then silence. The cold vanished. She opened her eyes, and the room was empty. The stain on the floor was gone. The door swung open with ease, and Jenna stumbled back into the basement, gasping for air. She ran upstairs, locking the basement door behind her. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone and called Diane. Diane answered on the first ring. "Hello? What is in that room?" Jenna demanded, her voice shaking. Diane was silent for a moment. Then she spoke softly. "You opened the door, didn't you?" "What's in there?" Jenna repeated, her fear turning to anger. Diane sighed. "I told you, some doors are better left closed." Jenna hung up and decided then and there that she needed to leave. She began packing her things, ready to get out of that apartment for good. But as she reached for her suitcase, she heard it again, the faint rhythmic tapping coming from the basement. It was louder this time, like someone knocking insistently, impatiently. And then she heard the whispering, clearer now, "Come back, come back." Jenna felt a chill run down her spine. She grabbed her suitcase and ran out the door, not looking back. As she reached her car, she glanced up at the apartment window. Diane was standing there, watching her with that same strange smile, her lips moving silently, as if repeating the same phrase over and over again, "You should have left it closed." Jenna drove away, leaving the apartment behind. But the tapping and whispering followed her in her dreams every night. And in the back of her mind, she knew the door would always be waiting for someone else to open it. Title: The Antique Mirror. Mia had always loved collecting antiques. There was something thrilling about owning a piece of history, something that had been touched and used by people long gone. Her apartment was filled with curiosities, old clocks, vintage lamps, weathered books, but she had one wall that was still bare, and she was looking for the perfect mirror to complete the room. One night, while browsing Craigslist, she came across a listing. Antique mirror, ornate, very old, free to a good home. The photo showed a beautiful mirror with a heavy gold leaf frame, carved with intricate floral patterns. The glass was slightly foggy, but it added to the charm. Mia felt a surge of excitement. A mirror like this would normally cost a fortune. She quickly messaged the seller, a man named Richard, who replied almost instantly. He explained that the mirror had belonged to his grandmother and had been in the family for generations, but he no longer had space for it. "I just want it to go to someone who appreciates it," he wrote. "You can come by tonight to pick it up if you like." Mia agreed immediately and headed over to the address he provided, an old, run-down house on the outskirts of town. The place was a bit isolated, but she figured that was why he was giving away such a valuable item for free. When she arrived, Richard was waiting on the porch. He was a tall, thin man with deep-set eyes and a nervous smile. "Thanks for coming," he said quickly, ushering her inside. "The mirror is in the living room." Mia stepped into the dimly lit house. The air was stale, and the walls were lined with old photographs and dusty shelves filled with knickknacks. She followed Richard into the living room where the mirror stood, leaning against the wall. It was even more beautiful in person. The frame was a bit worn, but the craftsmanship was exquisite. The glass, however, had a strange quality, almost like it was rippling slightly, even though the air in the room was still. "It's perfect," Mia said, unable to hide her excitement. "Thank you so much." Richard's smile faded a little. "There's just one thing," he said slowly, his voice tense. "You must never cover it, not even at night. It needs to be exposed to air, always." Mia blinked, puzzled. "Why?" Richard hesitated. "It's just An old family superstition, he said, waving a hand dismissively. Just humor me, okay? Mia nodded, feeling a bit uneasy but still thrilled about her find. She agreed, and with Richard's help loaded the mirror into her car. Back at her apartment, Mia found the perfect spot on the wall opposite her bed. She hung the mirror carefully, admiring how it seemed to complete the room. As she stood back to admire her work, she noticed something odd. The reflection seemed slightly distorted, like the image wasn't quite right. She shrugged it off, assuming it was just the old glass, and went about her evening. That night, she woke up suddenly, heart pounding. She wasn't sure why. Her room was dark, but the moonlight filtered in through the curtains. She turned over and glanced at the mirror. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw movement in the glass like a shadow flickering across it. She blinked, rubbing her eyes, but the mirror was still. She told herself it was just her imagination and went back to sleep. The next morning, she noticed something strange. The mirror seemed clearer. The fogginess she'd seen before was gone, and the glass was now perfectly reflective. She stepped closer, examining it. It almost looked like new. She frowned, unsure what to make of it, but dismissed it as a trick of the light. Over the next few days, odd things began to happen. She would catch glimpses of movement in the mirror out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. She would hear faint whispers at night, too soft to understand, but persistent, like a conversation just out of earshot. One evening, as she was brushing her hair in front of the mirror, she noticed something that made her skin crawl. Her reflection didn't quite match her movements. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was a slight lag, a delay in the way her reflection blinked or turned its head. Mia stepped back, heart racing. She waved her hand in front of the mirror, and her reflection followed, but just a fraction of a second too late. She shook her head, telling herself she was imagining things, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, the whispers were louder. She could hear them clearly now, words that made no sense. Come closer. Come closer. Mia sat up in bed, staring at the mirror. The glass seemed to shimmer, and she felt an inexplicable pull, like something was drawing her toward it. She stood up slowly, almost against her will, and walked toward the mirror. As she got closer, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She reached out to touch the glass, and her fingers brushed against it. The surface felt strange, almost like water, rippling under her touch. Her reflection stared back at her, but there was something wrong with its eyes. They were too dark, too deep, like they were looking through her rather than at her. Suddenly, a cold hand grabbed her wrist from the other side of the glass. Mia screamed, jerking back, and the mirror seemed to pulse with a dark light. Her reflection grinned, a twisted, unnatural smile, and then the glass went still. Breathing heavily, Mia stumbled back, her heart pounding. She grabbed a blanket from her bed and, despite Richard's warning, threw it over the mirror, covering it completely. For the first time in days, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent, and Mia felt a wave of relief wash over her. She went back to bed, exhausted, but calmer. The next morning, she decided to get rid of the mirror. She called a friend to help her move it out. But when they pulled the blanket off, she froze. The mirror was cracked. A long, jagged line ran from the top corner to the bottom. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. In the reflection, she could see her room just as it was. But in the corner, where she had been standing the night before, there was a dark figure, a tall, shadowy shape with eyes that glinted like glass. Mia turned around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there. She looked back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Her friend, noticing her expression, asked, "Are you okay?" Mia nodded slowly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, let's just get it out of here." They carried the mirror down to the alley behind her building, and Mia propped it against the wall. She felt a strange sense of relief leaving it there, exposed to the open air. That night she slept soundly for the first time in days. But in the morning, as she stepped outside, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The mirror was back in her living room, leaning against the wall where it had originally been hung. The blanket was on the floor, and the crack was gone. The glass was clear again, perfectly reflective. Mia stood frozen, staring at it. Her reflection stared back, and then slowly it smiled. She turned and ran, grabbing her phone to call Richard. His number was disconnected. She searched for the original Craigslist listing, but it had been deleted. There was no trace of Richard, no trace of the ad. Mia knew she had to leave. She packed a bag, ready to go, but as she reached title, The Roommate, Cassie had just moved to a new city for her job, and finding an affordable apartment was proving to be nearly impossible. After weeks of searching, she stumbled upon a Craigslist ad. Roommate wanted. Large room in quiet house, low rent. The price was too good to pass up, and the location was perfect. Just a short commute to her new office. She emailed the poster, a woman named Beth, and got a response almost immediately. They set up a time to meet, and Cassie headed over that evening. The house was an old, charming two-story on a quiet street. It had a warm, inviting look with flowers blooming in the front yard and a cozy porch swing. Beth answered the door with a wide smile. She was in her late 30s, with curly hair and kind eyes. "You must be Cassie," she said. "Come on in, let me show you around." Cassie liked her immediately. Beth seemed friendly and down to earth, and the house had a pleasant, homey feel. The room for rent was spacious, with plenty of natural light and a view of the garden. Cassie noticed a few old-fashioned knickknacks around the house, but she found them charming. "I have a few house rules," Beth explained as they sat in the living room. "I'm pretty quiet, and I hope for the same for my roommate. Also, I'd prefer you not go into the basement. It's just storage, but it's kind of a mess, and I don't want anyone getting hurt down there." Cassie nodded. The rules seemed reasonable. After all, she had no reason to go into the basement. She agreed to move in that weekend. The first week went by smoothly. Beth was a great roommate, considerate, quiet, and neat. They chatted in the evenings, and Cassie started to feel at home. She was glad to have found such a perfect place so quickly. But a few days later, she began to notice odd things. It started with little noises at night, soft creaking sounds like footsteps coming from the basement. At first, she thought it was just the house settling or maybe Beth moving around. But the noises grew louder, and sometimes she heard what sounded like a faint humming. Cassie mentioned it to Beth one morning. "Do you hear those noises at night?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Beth looked at her for a moment, her expression unreadable, and then smiled. "Oh, that's probably just the house. It's old and it makes sounds sometimes. Nothing to worry about." Cassie nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. She started to pay closer attention, and that's when she noticed other strange things. A few times she'd leave something in one spot, her keys, a book, a hairbrush, and find it moved somewhere else. She brushed it off at first, thinking she was just being forgetful. One night, while getting ready for bed, she heard a soft knocking on her bedroom wall, like someone tapping from the other side. She paused, listening. The tapping stopped. She felt a chill run down her spine. Was it coming from the basement? The next morning, she asked Beth again, trying to be polite but firm. "I keep hearing noises from the basement. Are you sure there isn't something down there?" Beth's smile seemed a little strained. "It's just old pipes, Cassie. Trust me, it's nothing. Please don't worry about it." Cassie tried to let it go, but curiosity gnawed at her. One night, after Beth had gone to bed, she found herself standing in front of the basement door. She hesitated, remembering Beth's rule, but then a soft sound, like a muffled cry, made her jump. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had to know. She reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a dark stairway. She fumbled for the light switch, but couldn't find one. She took a deep breath and descended the stairs, her phone flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was cluttered, filled with old furniture, boxes, and dust-covered knickknacks. The air was musty, and the temperature dropped the further she went down. She noticed a large wardrobe against the far wall, and for some reason it drew her in. She felt an inexplicable urge to open it. As she reached for the handle, she heard a soft, shuffling noise behind her. She spun around, her flashlight beam searching the darkness, but saw nothing. Her heart raced. She turned back to the wardrobe, her hand trembling as she grasped the handle and pulled it open. Inside was empty, at first glance. But then she saw it, a small door at the back, just big enough for someone to crawl through. Her curiosity piqued. She crouched down and peered inside. The air was colder here, and she could feel a draft coming from the small door. Suddenly, she heard a noise above her, the creak of a floorboard. She looked up, but there was no one there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned back to the small door. Without thinking, she reached out and pushed it open. The smell hit her first. Damp, earth, and something metallic, like rust or blood. She hesitated, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Then she heard it again, a faint, muffled cry, like someone calling for help. The sound was coming from inside the small passageway. Cassie's stomach twisted with fear, but she felt a compulsion to know what was behind that door. She crawled through, the space tightening around her. The cries grew louder, more urgent. She could feel her breath quickening, her pulse racing. Suddenly, she emerged into a small, dark room. Her flashlight revealed dirt walls and a low ceiling. She saw a figure huddled in the corner, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a woman, her hair disheveled, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She looked up, and her eyes widened in fear. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice hoarse. "Help me. She won't let me leave." Cassie's heart raced. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew. "Beth," the woman said, her voice trembling. "She locked me in here. I don't know how long it's been. Please, you have to help me." Cassie reached out to the woman, but as she did, she heard footsteps above, coming down the basement stairs. She turned, panic rising. "We have to go now," she whispered. The woman nodded, and they crawled back through the small door into the basement. Cassie's hands were shaking as she stood up. She could hear the footsteps getting closer, and then she saw a shadow at the top of the stairs. "Cassie?" Beth's voice called down, soft but strangely cold. "What are you doing down there?" Cassie felt her blood run cold. I just heard something," she stammered. "I wanted to check it out." Beth descended the stairs slowly, her face unreadable in the dim light. She stopped at the bottom step, her eyes locking onto Cassie's. "I told you not to come down here," she said, her voice low. Cassie glanced at the woman she had found, but to her horror there was no one there. The corner where the woman had been was empty. Cassie's heart pounded in her chest. She looked back at Beth, who was now smiling, a slow, unsettling smile. "You shouldn't have come down here." "Okay," Beth whispered. Cassie backed away, stumbling over a box. She turned and ran up the stairs, her breath coming in short gasps. She could hear Beth behind her, her footsteps slow and deliberate. Cassie grabbed her keys and fled out the front door, not daring to look back. She ran to her car and drove off, her hands shaking on the wheel. When she finally dared to look in the rearview mirror, she saw Beth standing on the porch, watching her with that same unsettling smile. Cassie never went back to the house. She found a new place to live and tried to put the experience behind her, but she couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes watching her. One day, a few weeks later, she decided to search the local news archives, curious about what she might find. And there it was, a small article buried in the back pages. "Woman found dead in basement of rental house," the headline read. Her heart stopped as she saw the date. It was 2 years ago. The woman's name was Beth. The article mentioned a suspect, a woman who had been living there as her roommate. Her name was never released. Cassie felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She closed the page, her hands trembling, knowing that somewhere in that quiet, charming house, the real Beth was still waiting for a new roommate. Title: The Photographer. Emily was an aspiring photographer who had recently moved to the city to pursue her passion. She spent her days wandering through urban landscapes, capturing the life and essence of the streets. Her Instagram was filled with moody black and white photos, portraits of strangers, and scenes that felt frozen in time. She loved the thrill of finding beauty in unexpected places, and she always kept an eye out for opportunities to grow her portfolio. One night, while scrolling through Craigslist, Emily found a peculiar listing in the gigs section. It read, "Photographer needed. Overnight shoot. $1,000 for one night's work." The ad was simple, but the pay was too good to pass up. She clicked on the link, expecting to find more details. The message was brief. Looking for a talented photographer for an exclusive one-night shoot. Must be available tonight from midnight to 4 a.m. Location will be provided after confirmation. Serious inquiries only. Payment in cash. Emily hesitated for a moment. The whole thing seemed odd. No location, no description of the work. But the money was tempting, and she needed to build her portfolio. She replied to the email, stating her interest, and within minutes, she received a response. "Thank you for your interest, Emily. Meet me at the Old Elm Cemetery at midnight. I will find you. Bring your best equipment. Come alone. A chill ran down her spine. A cemetery? At midnight? She almost deleted the email, but the promise of $1,000 kept her from hitting the trash button. Maybe it was just an eccentric artist or a themed shoot. She decided to take the risk. It was just one night, and she could always leave if things felt off. At 11:45 p.m., Emily drove to the Old Elm Cemetery, her camera bag on the passenger seat. The cemetery was a well-known historical site, sprawling and overgrown, with headstones dating back to the 1800s. It was a popular spot for urban explorers, but being there alone at midnight was something else entirely. She parked her car outside the rusted iron gates and checked the time. 11:59 p.m. She took a deep breath, grabbed her bag, and stepped out into the chilly night air. The cemetery was eerily quiet. The wind rustled through the trees, and a faint mist hovered over the ground, making the tombstones appear like shadows in the darkness. She walked through the gates and waited, her eyes scanning the area. The moon was full, casting a silvery light over the gravestones. She felt a mix of excitement and fear. Maybe this was a bad idea. Maybe she should leave. But just as she turned to head back to her car, she heard a voice. "Emily?" She spun around and saw a man standing a few feet away. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, his face partially hidden in the shadows. "Yes," she replied, trying to steady her voice. "Are you the one who posted the ad?" The man nodded. "Thank you for coming. Follow me. We don't have much time." He turned and began walking deeper into the cemetery without waiting for her response. Emily hesitated, then decided to follow. She reminded herself that she could always leave if things felt too strange. They walked in silence for several minutes, winding through the maze of headstones. The man moved quickly with a sense of urgency, occasionally glancing back to make sure she was following. Finally, they reached a clearing with a large, ornate mausoleum at the center. "This is the spot," the man said, stopping abruptly. "I need you to photograph the mausoleum, every detail. The carvings, the entrance, the stained glass window at the back, and if you see anything unusual, capture it." Emily felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. Unusual? Like what? The man's face remained in shadow, but she could hear a hint of tension in his voice. "You'll know it when you see it." She nodded, trying to hide her unease, and began setting up her camera. The mausoleum was old, its stone walls covered in ivy, the door slightly ajar. She started snapping photos, moving around the structure, capturing every angle, every crack in the stone. The air was cold, and she could see her breath in the moonlight. As she moved to the back of the mausoleum, she felt a sudden drop in temperature, colder than before. She glanced around, her heartbeat quickening. She was alone. The man had disappeared. A low mist had begun to roll in, swirling around her feet. She heard a faint sound, like whispering, coming from inside the mausoleum. She paused, lowering her camera. The door creaked open slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew she should leave, but something compelled her to move closer. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. She could make out fragments of words, a language she couldn't understand. She raised her camera and took a few photos of the entrance. The flash illuminated the darkness inside for a split second, and she saw a glimpse of something that moved. Her hands shook, and she stepped back, her heart pounding. She reviewed the photos on her camera screen, but they were strangely overexposed, washed out with light. Frustrated, she adjusted the settings and tried again, peering through the viewfinder. That's when she saw them, figures, shadowy shapes moving just beyond the threshold, their forms hazy and indistinct. She blinked, and they were gone. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. She took another photo, and this time, the whispering stopped. Silence. She felt a presence behind her and spun around, but there was no one there. The air felt thick, suffocating. Then she saw it on her camera screen, an image she hadn't taken. A photo of herself standing by the mausoleum, but she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, his face did in a silent scream, eyes wide with terror. Her heart stopped. She knew that face. It was the man who had hired her. But how? When had the photo been taken? Panicking, she turned and ran toward the entrance of the cemetery, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The mist seemed to thicken around her, and the path twisted and turned, unfamiliar now. She felt lost, disoriented. Then she saw it, a figure standing by the gates. Relief flooded through her. She ran faster, calling out, "Help, please!" As she got closer, the figure didn't move. She slowed down, her steps faltering. It was the man, the same man. But his face was wrong. It was distorted, stretched into an unnatural smile, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice a low whisper that seemed to echo in the night air. "You've done well." She stumbled back, terror gripping her. "What do you mean?" she gasped. "What is this?" The man's smile widened, his features twisting into something inhuman. "You've captured what I needed," he said. "Now, I'm free." And with that, he began to dissolve into the mist, his form dissipating like smoke in the wind. Emily stared in horror, unable to move as the mist enveloped him completely, and then he was gone. She turned and fled, running back to her car. She didn't stop until she was inside, doors locked, heart racing. She looked down at her camera, her hands shaking. Hesher, the Craigslist photographer. It was a warm Friday evening in late September, and Claire was scrolling through Craigslist, looking for freelance gigs to supplement her income. She was a budding photographer, still trying to make a name for herself. Most of her work came from small weddings and local events, but tonight, something different caught her eye. A listing for a unique photography opportunity. Photographer needed to document an estate in the countryside. $500 for the evening. Discretion required. Claire clicked on the ad. Her curiosity piqued. The pay was good, better than what she usually earned. She responded to the ad, and within minutes, she received a reply with the address and instructions to arrive by 7 p.m. the next evening. The following day, she packed her camera gear and made the 2-hour drive to the address. The sun dipped low in the sky as she turned onto a long, winding road that led to an old, isolated estate. The house loomed in the distance, a grand yet decaying Victorian mansion. Vines crawled up the sides, and the windows were dark, staring out like hollow eyes. As Claire pulled up to the house, she noticed there were no other cars around. The place looked deserted, save for the light glowing faintly from a room on the second floor. She hesitated, but then reminded herself of the $500 waiting for her. Money was tight, and she couldn't afford to pass up this opportunity. She grabbed her camera and walked up to the front door. Before she could knock, the door creaked open slightly, as if it had been left ajar. Claire pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was stale, and the floorboards groaned beneath her feet. The entryway was lined with old portraits, their subjects staring at her with cold, lifeless eyes. "Hello?" Claire called out, her voice echoing through the empty halls. There was no response, only the sound of the wind rattling the windows. She took a deep breath and started up the grand staircase toward the light she had seen from outside. As she reached the top, she heard a soft, rustling noise coming from one of the rooms. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to keep moving. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and Claire gently pushed it open. Inside, the room was sparsely furnished, with an antique bed draped in dusty sheets and a large, ornate mirror on the wall. But what caught her attention was the man standing by the window, his back to her. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark suit that looked like it belonged to another century. "Hello, I'm Claire, the photographer," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The man didn't turn around. Instead, he spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "Thank you for coming. Please begin your work." Claire hesitated for a moment, then raised her camera and began taking pictures of the room. The man remained still, his gaze fixed on something outside the window. As she moved around the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The atmosphere was heavy, oppressive, and she couldn't understand why anyone would want photos of this decaying room. After a while, she asked, "Would you like me to photograph anything specific?" The man finally turned to face her. Claire gasped and took a step back. His face was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. But what unnerved her the most was his expression. He looked terrified. "Photograph the mirror," he said quietly, almost pleading. Claire turned toward the mirror. It was large, with an intricately carved frame, and the glass was slightly warped with age. She raised her camera and took a few shots, but as she did, she noticed something strange. In the reflection, she could see herself and the man standing behind her, but there was something else, a shadowy figure lurking in the corner of the room. Her blood ran cold. She spun around, but the corner was empty. She looked back at the mirror, and the figure was still there, now moving closer to her reflection. The man behind her began to sob quietly. "What is this?" Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "The mirror? It shows them," the man said, his voice trembling. "The ones who lived here before. They were trapped, and now they haunt this place." Claire's hands shook as she lowered the camera. "Why did you bring me here?" The man looked at her with sorrowful eyes. "I needed someone to see, to capture them. They need to be remembered, or they'll never be free." Claire didn't know what to do. Her instinct was to run, but something kept her rooted to the spot. She glanced at the mirror again. The figure was closer now, almost right behind her reflection. Panic surged through her, and she backed away from the mirror. "I can't stay here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded. "I'm sorry, but it's too late." Before Claire could react, the mirror shattered, and the room was plunged into darkness. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder and screamed, spinning around to find herself alone in the room. The man was gone, and the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. She pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The cold hand returned, this time gripping her wrist. Claire looked down to see a ghostly figure, its hollow eyes staring up at her, pulling her toward the mirror's shattered remains. Desperate, she yanked her hand free and bolted for the window. She smashed it with her camera and scrambled out, cutting herself on the shards of glass. She ran to her car, not daring to look back at the house. As she drove away, she could still feel the cold grip on her wrist, the ghostly presence lingering. When she finally reached home, Claire looked down at her camera, still in her lap. The screen flickered, showing the last photo she had taken, a clear image of the shadowy figure, its face now fully visible. But the most horrifying detail was the reflection of herself in the mirror. In the photo, she wasn't alone. The next morning, Claire's Craigslist account was hacked, and a new ad appeared. Photographer needed for a unique opportunity at an old estate. Discretion required. Claire smashed her laptop, but deep down, she knew the truth. The mirror was still waiting. The Craigslist babysitter, Megan, was a college student looking for some extra cash, so when she saw the Craigslist ad for a one-night babysitting job, she jumped at the opportunity. The ad was straightforward. Babysitter needed for the evening. $200 for 5 hours. Must be good with children. The job seemed easy enough, and the pay was almost too good to be true. She quickly responded to the ad and got an immediate reply with the address and a note saying, "Please arrive by 6 p.m. The address was in an affluent neighborhood about 30 minutes away from her campus. It was a quiet area with large, well-maintained houses, the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Megan arrived a few minutes early, parking her car in front of a charming 2-story home with a perfectly manicured lawn. She took a deep breath, grabbed her bag, and walked up to the door. She knocked, and within seconds, the door opened to reveal a tall, thin man in his late 30s. He had dark hair that was slicked back, and his eyes were a piercing blue. His smile seemed friendly enough, but there was something about him that made Megan feel uneasy. "You must be Megan," the man said, his voice smooth and calm. "I'm Mr. Wilson. Thank you for coming on such short notice." "No problem," Megan replied, forcing a smile. "I'm happy to help. Please come in," Mr. Wilson said, stepping aside to let her enter. Megan walked into the house, immediately noticing how quiet it was. The interior was tastefully decorated with modern furniture and artwork lining the walls, but there was something off about the place. It felt too perfect, almost staged. "Where's the child I'll be watching?" Megan asked, trying to make conversation as they walked deeper into the house. "Lily is upstairs, in her room," Mr. Wilson said, his smile never wavering. "She's very shy, so it might take her some time to warm up to you." "That's okay," Megan said. "I'm used to shy kids." Mr. Wilson led her to the base of the staircase. "I'll be back by 11 p.m. There's food in the fridge if you get hungry, and the Wi-Fi password is on a note by the TV. Lily's bedtime is 9 p.m. Please make sure she's in bed by then." "Got it," Megan said, feeling slightly more at ease now that she knew the routine. Mr. Wilson nodded, then hesitated for a moment before saying, "One more thing. Lily has a vivid imagination. She might say some strange things, but please don't be alarmed." Megan raised an eyebrow but didn't press for more details. "Okay, I'll keep that in mind." With that, Mr. Wilson grabbed his coat and left the house, leaving Megan alone. She took a moment to compose herself, then headed upstairs to find Lily's room. The hallway upstairs was dimly lit, with old family photos hanging on the walls. Megan noticed that in all the photos, there was a little girl with blonde hair, presumably Lily, but something about the images struck her as odd. In every photo, Lily seemed distant, never smiling, her eyes always staring just off to the side, as if looking at something or someone just out of frame. Megan shook off the uneasy feeling and approached the door at the end of the hall, which was slightly ajar. She knocked softly. "Lily? It's Megan. I'll be watching you tonight." There was no response, so Megan gently pushed the door open. Inside, the room was decorated in soft pinks and whites, with stuffed animals lined up neatly on the bed. But the room was empty. She frowned and looked around, wondering where Lily could be. Then she noticed a small door on the other side of the room, partially hidden behind a large dollhouse. It was one of those doors that led to an attic or a crawl space. Megan walked over and hesitated before calling out again. "Lily? Are you in there?" There was a moment of silence, then a soft giggle came from behind the door. Megan's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay calm. She crouched down and gently opened the small door. Behind it was a tiny, dark space, just big enough for a child to crawl into. At the back of the space, she saw two glowing eyes staring at her. "Lily?" Megan whispered, her voice trembling. The eyes blinked, and a little girl crawled out of the darkness. She had blonde hair and was wearing a white nightgown, just like in the photos. But up close, Megan could see that Lily looked even more unsettling. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide and unblinking. "Hi, Megan," Lily said in a soft, sing-song voice. "Do you want to play with me?" Megan forced a smile. "Sure, what do you want to play?" Lily grinned, showing small, sharp teeth. "Let's play hide and seek. You hide, and I'll find you." Megan hesitated. Not sure if this was a good idea, but she didn't want to upset Lily. "Okay, but only for a little while. It's almost bedtime." Lily giggled again and turned around, covering her eyes with her hands. 1, 2, 3. Megan quickly looked around the room, trying to find a place to hide. She spotted the closet and quietly slipped inside, leaving the door slightly ajar so she could see out. She heard Lily finish counting and the soft sound of her footsteps moving around the room. Megan waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear Lily's voice, but it was strange. She was talking to someone. "Where is she?" Lily whispered. "Do you see her?" There was a pause, and then Lily giggled. "You're right. She's in the closet." Megan's blood ran cold. How did she know? She hadn't made a sound. She held her breath as the closet door slowly creaked open. Lily stood there, smiling up at her. But then Megan noticed something even more terrifying. Behind Lily, in the shadows of the room, was another figure, a tall, dark silhouette with long, bony fingers that seemed to stretch toward her. Megan screamed and bolted out of the closet, grabbing Lily and pulling her out of the room. She didn't stop running until they were downstairs in the brightly lit living room. Panting, she looked at Lily, who was strangely calm, almost as if nothing had happened. "What was that?" Megan demanded, her voice shaking. Lily tilted her head, her expression innocent. "That's just my friend. He likes to play too." Megan was about to respond when she heard the sound of the front door opening. Mr. Wilson walked in, a look of concern on his face. Is everything okay?" he asked, looking between Megan and Lily. Megan struggled to find the words. "There's something in the house, something in Lily's room." Mr. Wilson's expression softened, and he sighed. "I'm sorry, Megan. I should have warned you. Lily, she sees things that aren't really there." Megan shook her head. "No, I saw it too. There was something in the room with us." Mr. Wilson smiled sadly. "I know it's frightening, but it's just Lily's imagination. She has a way of making others see what she sees." Megan stared at him, her mind racing. Was it possible that she had imagined the whole thing? That Lily had somehow influenced her? "I think it's time for you to go," Mr. Wilson said gently. "Thank you for watching, Lily. You'll find your payment on the table." Megan didn't argue. She grabbed her things and rushed out of the house, not stopping until she was safely in her car. She looked back at the house, expecting to see something, anything, in the windows, but the house was dark and still. As she drove away, Megan tried to convince herself that it was all just her imagination. that Lily had somehow played a trick on her mind. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something that had followed her from that house. Later that night, after Megan had returned to her dorm and was trying to sleep, her phone buzzed with a new message. She picked it up and froze. It was a picture, sent from an unknown number. The photo was of her, hiding in the closet, and behind her, in the shadows, was a tall, dark figure with bony fingers reaching out toward her. The Craigslist roommate. After breaking up with her long-term boyfriend, Jessica needed a fresh start. She decided to move out of their shared apartment and find a place of her own. Money was tight, so she scoured Craigslist for a cheap room to rent. One ad caught her eye. Room for rent. $300 a month. Utilities included. Female preferred. The ad was short and to the point, but what drew her in was the price. It was a steal, especially in the city. Jessica contacted the poster, who identified herself as Hannah, and arranged to see the room the next day. The house was in an older, quieter part of town. It was a tall, narrow Victorian with dark green paint that was peeling in places. The neighborhood felt a bit isolated, but Jessica convinced herself that it would be peaceful. When she arrived, Hannah greeted her at the door. She was petite, with long black hair and sharp features. There was something about her that was both alluring and unsettling, a coldness in her eyes that Jessica couldn't quite place. But she was polite and soft-spoken, making small talk as she showed Jessica around the house. The interior was dimly lit, with heavy drapes that kept most of the sunlight out. The furniture was old and worn, giving the place a slightly eerie vibe. Still, Jessica was focused on her goal, a place to live that wouldn't break the bank. Hannah led her upstairs to the available room. It was small but clean, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the backyard. The rent was incredibly cheap, and Jessica could already see herself moving in. "I'll take it," Jessica said, not wanting to waste any time. The sooner she moved out of her ex's apartment, the better. Hannah smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Great. You can move in tomorrow if you'd like." Jessica agreed, and the next day, she packed up her things and moved into the new place. The first night was uneventful. She spent the evening unpacking and getting settled in, then went to bed early. But it wasn't long before things started to get strange. On her second night, Jessica was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when she heard a soft creaking noise coming from above her. At first, she thought it was just the old house settling, but the sound persisted, a rhythmic creak like footsteps on the floor above. Curious, she got out of bed and walked out into the hallway. She looked up at the ceiling, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from the attic. Jessica frowned. Hannah hadn't mentioned anything about the attic. She hadn't even seen a door leading to it. But the footsteps continued, slowly pacing back and forth. It didn't sound like an animal. Whatever was up there was heavy. She decided to ask Hannah about it in the morning. When she did, Hannah's reaction was oddly dismissive. "Oh, that's just the house," Hannah said with a small smile. "It's old and makes noises sometimes. Don't worry about it." Jessica wasn't entirely convinced, but she let it go, not wanting to seem paranoid. That night, however, the noises grew louder. The footsteps were more distinct, and they seemed to be moving around the attic more frantically. It almost sounded like someone was pacing back and forth, agitated. Again, Jessica went into the hallway and stood beneath the attic, listening. This time she noticed something new, a faint whispering, just on the edge of hearing. It sent a chill down her spine. She thought about knocking on Hannah's door to ask if she could hear it too, but something stopped her, a nagging feeling that maybe she didn't want to know what was really going on. As the days passed, the noises in the attic became a nightly occurrence. Jessica found herself growing more and more uneasy, her sleep constantly interrupted by the sounds above. The footsteps would start slowly, then speed up, followed by the whispers, always just out of reach, like a distant conversation she wasn't meant to hear. One night, Jessica had had enough. She couldn't take the noise anymore, and her curiosity had turned into a need to know what was happening in the attic. She grabbed a flashlight and started searching the house for the attic door. She found it in the hallway, hidden behind a heavy tapestry. The door was small and old, with a rusted handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Jessica hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to turn the handle. It creaked loudly as the door swung open, revealing a narrow wooden staircase leading up into darkness. Taking a deep breath, she started up the stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the thick, musty air. The higher she climbed, the stronger the smell of decay became, until she reached the top and saw the source of the stench. The attic was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, but in the center of the room was something that made Jessica's blood run cold. A large wooden crate, covered in dust and cobwebs. The smell was coming from inside it. She approached the crate, every instinct telling her to turn back, but she couldn't stop herself. The footsteps she had heard every night, this was the source, she was sure of it. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid of the crate. Inside was a decomposing body. Jessica stumbled back, horrified, her mind racing. The body was dressed in a tattered old nightgown, and it looked like it had been there for years. But the most terrifying thing was the face. It was Hannah, or at least it looked like Hannah, but older, and with a look of pure terror frozen on her decayed features. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut behind her. Jessica whipped around, the flashlight flickering in her shaking hand. Standing in the doorway was Hannah, or what looked like her. But now, her eyes were completely black, her skin pale and lifeless. "You shouldn't have come up here," the figure whispered, its voice no longer soft and warm, but cold and hollow. Jessica screamed and ran for the door, but the figure lunged at her, its bony fingers reaching out. She managed to shove it aside and dashed down the stairs, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She raced through the house, not daring to look back, until she was outside, gulping in the cool night air. She didn't stop running until she was in her car, driving as fast as she could away from the house. The image of the corpse in the crate, the thing that looked like Hannah, and the black eyes, all of it replayed in her mind over and over. The next morning, Jessica went straight to the police. She told them everything, hoping they would investigate. But when they arrived at the house, it was empty. There was no sign of Hannah, no sign that anyone had lived there for years. The attic was completely sealed off, with no crate and no body to be found. The police didn't believe her, but Jessica knew what she had seen. She moved out of the city, abandoning all thoughts of cheap rent and Craigslist. But the nightmares never stopped. Every night, she would hear those footsteps, that frantic pacing, and the whispers that seemed to come from just beyond the veil of sleep. And in the darkest moments of the night, she would see those black eyes staring at her from the corner of her room, reminding her that some things, once uncovered, never truly leave. The Craigslist antique Samantha loved hunting for vintage items. Thrift stores, garage sales, estate auctions. She scoured them all, looking for hidden treasures. But one evening, as she was browsing Craigslist for something new, she stumbled upon an ad that caught her attention. Antique mirror for sale, late 19th century. Needs a good home. The mirror in the photo was beautiful, ornate with a heavy gilded frame that looked like it had seen better days. But there was something about it that drew Samantha in, something she couldn't quite place. The price was a steal for such a piece, so she contacted the seller immediately. The response came quickly. The seller, an older woman named Mrs. Whitmore, explained that the mirror had been in her family for generations, but she was moving into a retirement home and needed to downsize. She emphasized that the mirror had to go to someone who appreciated its history. Eager to add the piece to her collection, Samantha arranged to pick it up the next day. Mrs. Whitmore's house was in a quiet part of town, in an area filled with old, grand homes. When Samantha arrived, she was greeted by a frail, elderly woman with silver hair and tired eyes. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Whitmore said softly as she led Samantha inside. The house was filled with antiques, each one meticulously cared for. But Samantha's attention was immediately drawn to the mirror, which was propped up against a wall in the living room. Up close, it was even more beautiful than the photo had suggested. The frame was intricately carved with swirling patterns, and though the glass was cloudy with age, it still reflected the room around it. "Are you sure you want to sell it?" Samantha asked, unable to hide her excitement. Mrs. Whitmore nodded slowly. "Yes, it's time to let go, but I must warn you, this mirror has a history. My family, we always believed it was haunted." Samantha raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Haunted? Mrs. Whitmore's expression grew serious. Strange things have happened over the years. People see things in the reflection that aren't really there. My husband, he saw things that drove him mad. I don't know if it's true, but I feel you should know before you take it. Samantha hesitated for only a moment. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses. She was too practical for that. And even if the mirror had a spooky reputation, it would make a great conversation piece. Besides, the price was too good to pass up. I'll take it, she said, handing over the money. Mrs. Whitmore sighed, a look of relief mixed with sadness crossing her face. Take care of it, dear, and be careful. Samantha loaded the mirror into her car and drove home, excited to find the perfect spot for it in her apartment. She decided to hang it in her bedroom, opposite her bed, where it could be the first thing she saw every morning. The mirror looked stunning in the soft light, and for a few days, everything was normal. But then, things began to change. It started with small things. Samantha would wake up in the morning to find the mirror slightly askew, even though she was certain it had been straight the night before. Objects in her bedroom would shift places when she wasn't looking, but she chalked it up to her own forgetfulness. She was busy, after all. Work had been hectic, and she wasn't getting much sleep. Then came the shadows. Late at night, as Samantha lay in bed, she started to notice something odd in the mirror. At first, it was just a flicker, a trick of the light, she told herself. But soon she began to see movement in the reflection, dark shapes that seemed to dart just out of sight whenever she tried to focus on them. One night, she woke up around 3 a.m. feeling a strange sense of unease. The room was quiet, too quiet, and she realized that the usual hum of the city outside her window was absent. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she turned her head to look at the mirror. What she saw made her heart stop. In the reflection, she could see her own bed, but there was something else, someone else. A figure stood at the foot of her bed, tall and shadowy, its face obscured by the darkness. It was staring directly at her. Samantha gasped and whipped around, but there was no one there. Her bedroom was empty, the door closed, and the only sound was her own ragged breathing. She turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Terrified, Samantha decided she had had enough. The mirror had to go. The next morning, she tried to contact Mrs. Whitmore, but the number she had called was disconnected. Frustrated and scared, she decided to take the mirror to a consignment shop, hoping to get rid of it as quickly as possible. But the shop refused to take it. "We don't deal with items like this," the owner said, eyeing the mirror warily. "There's something wrong with it." Desperate, Samantha tried to sell it online, but no one showed any interest. The more she tried to get rid of the mirror, the more it seemed to cling to her, like it was refusing to leave. The nights grew worse. Every time she looked into the mirror, she saw the figure. Sometimes it was closer, sometimes further away, but always watching her with those unseen eyes. She stopped sleeping, too afraid to close her eyes and wake up to find the figure in her room for real. Finally, one night, driven to the edge of madness, Samantha decided to destroy the mirror. She grabbed a hammer from her toolbox and stood before it, her hands shaking. The figure was there, closer than ever, looming over her in the reflection. With a scream, she swung the hammer at the mirror, shattering the glass into 1,000 pieces. The fragments scattered across the floor, glittering in the dim light. Samantha fell to her knees, gasping for breath, feeling a strange mix of relief and terror. But as she looked down at the shattered pieces, her heart froze. In each tiny shard of glass, the figure was still there, multiplied hundreds of times, all of them staring up at her from the floor. And then slowly, the shadows in the room began to move. The figure stepped out of the reflection, no longer confined to the mirror. It loomed over her, its presence overwhelming, the air growing colder and colder. Samantha tried to scream, but no sound came out. She scrambled backward, but it was too late. The last thing she saw was the figure reaching out for her, its icy touch sending a jolt of terror through her body before everything went dark. When Samantha's friends finally reported her missing, the police found her apartment in disarray. The mirror was gone, and there was no sign of a struggle, just the shattered glass on the floor and a lingering sense of unease that made the officers shiver. No one ever found out what happened to Samantha. But a few weeks, the Craigslist babysitter. When Lisa and Mark Wilson decided to have a date night, it was the first time in months they had a chance to take a break from parenting their energetic 3-year-old Emma. Lisa browsed Craigslist for a babysitter, hoping to find someone reliable and affordable. After scrolling through several ads, she came across one that seemed perfect. Experienced babysitter available, great with kids, CPR certified, and background checked. References available upon request, $12 hour. The ad was straightforward, and the photo showed a smiling young woman in her early 20s with friendly eyes and a warm expression. Her name was Claire. Without thinking twice, Lisa sent Claire a message, and within minutes they had arranged for her to come over the next evening. When Claire arrived, she was even more reassuring in person. She had a calm, gentle demeanor that immediately put Lisa at ease. Emma seemed to like her too, which was a relief. As Lisa and Mark headed out the door, Claire waved and promised to take good care of their daughter. The dinner went well, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lisa and Mark relaxed. They almost forgot they had a babysitter at home. However, about halfway through their meal, Lisa's phone buzzed with a text from Claire. Everything is fine, but Emma's acting a little strange. She keeps talking to someone in her room. She says it's her friend. Lisa frowned. Emma had an active imagination and sometimes talked to her stuffed animals as if they were real. She texted back, "That's normal for her. She has an imaginary friend. Nothing to worry about." Claire's response came quickly. "Okay, just thought I'd let you know. I'll keep an eye on her." Lisa shrugged it off and returned to her meal, but a small feeling of unease lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't unusual for kids to have imaginary friends, but something about Claire's text bothered her. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. When they got home later that night, the house was quiet. Claire was sitting on the couch reading a book, and Emma was asleep in her bed. "How was she?" Lisa asked, slipping off her shoes. "She was fine for the most part," Claire said, closing her book, "but she kept talking about this friend of hers, saying he was in the closet. I checked, of course, and there was nothing there, but it was a little unsettling. She was very insistent." Mark chuckled. "Kids and their imaginations, right?" Claire smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, I suppose so." After Claire left, Lisa checked on Emma, who was sound asleep, clutching her favorite stuffed bunny. Lisa kissed her on the forehead and quietly left the room. Over the next few days, Emma's behavior became increasingly odd. She would spend hours in her room, whispering to someone or something that Lisa and Mark couldn't see. When they asked her about it, she would simply say, "It's my friend. He doesn't like you." This unnerved Lisa. She had heard about children creating imaginary friends, but something about the way Emma spoke about this one felt different. Darker, somehow. One night, while Mark was working late, Lisa was putting Emma to bed when she noticed something strange. The closet door, which was usually closed, was slightly ajar. Emma stared at it, her little face tense with fear. "Mommy, close the door," Emma whispered, clutching her bunny tightly. Lisa frowned. "Why, sweetie?" "He's in there. He wants to come out." A chill ran down Lisa's spine. She walked over to the closet and pulled the door shut, making sure it was securely latched. Emma seemed to relax a little but refused to let go of her bunny as Lisa tucked her in. That night, Lisa couldn't sleep. She kept hearing small noises coming from Emma's room, little creaks and taps that she tried to convince herself were just the house settling. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, Lisa decided to contact Claire. Maybe she knew more about what was going on. When she called the number Claire had given her, it went straight to voicemail. Lisa left a message asking Claire to call her back, but she never did. That evening, as Lisa was cleaning up after dinner, she found something on the floor near Emma's closet. A small, old-fashioned key. It looked ancient, like something you'd find in an antique shop, with intricate designs etched into the metal. She had never seen it before and had no idea how it had gotten into Emma's room. Lisa's heart pounded as she examined the key. It didn't look like it belonged to anything in their house. She showed it to Mark when he got home, but he was just as baffled. "Maybe it's part of a toy or something?" Mark suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. That night, after they put Emma to bed, Lisa couldn't stop thinking about the key. Something was nagging at her. a feeling she couldn't shake. She decided to do some research online about old keys, hoping to find some clue as to where it might have come from. Hours passed as she clicked through countless pages, finding nothing that matched the key. Frustrated, she was about to give up when she stumbled upon a forum discussing haunted objects. One post caught her eye, a woman describing an antique key that had once been used to lock a cursed object away. According to the post, the key had been lost for decades, but it was said to have the power to open doors to other realms. The story sounded ridiculous, but something about it sent a shiver down Lisa's spine. She looked at the key again, feeling a growing sense of dread. What if it wasn't just a story? What if Emma's imaginary friend wasn't imaginary at all? That night, the noises from Emma's room were louder than ever. Lisa and Mark both heard them, scratching, whispering, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. They rushed to Emma's room, throwing open the door. The room was freezing cold, far colder than the rest of the house. Emma was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear, staring at the closet door, which was once again slightly open. "Mommy, he's angry," Emma whimpered. "He wants out." Lisa's heart raced as she grabbed the key, feeling its cold metal in her hand. Without thinking, she ran to the closet and yanked the door open. The room seemed to shift, the air growing thicker as a dark shape moved within the shadows of the closet. It was tall, with long, bony limbs and eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. It stepped toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. "Lisa?" Mark shouted, pulling her back. He slammed the closet door shut and latched it, but the scratching and banging from inside only grew louder. In a panic, Lisa looked down at the key, realizing it was somehow connected to whatever was in the closet. She ran to the kitchen, grabbed a hammer, and began to smash the key against the countertop, desperately trying to destroy it. After several frantic blows, the key finally snapped in half. The instant it did, the noises from the closet stopped. The house fell silent, the oppressive cold lifting as quickly as it had come. Trembling, Lisa and Mark returned to Emma's room. The closet door remained closed, and when they opened it cautiously, the inside was just a normal, empty closet. Emma slept peacefully through the rest of the night, unaware of the terror that had taken place. The next morning, Lisa and Mark packed up and moved out of the house, not willing to spend another night there. They never heard from Claire again. When they tried to find the original Craigslist ad, it had been deleted with no trace of it left.